everyone, I am Rey Jewel from the third group reporting. For today's presentation, we will be reporting the global trade and investment environment. For the first headline, Donald Trump has voiced strong opposition to trade deals designed to lower tariff barriers and foster the free flow of goods and services between the United States and its trading partners. He called NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, as the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, and vowed to kill the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade deal among 12 Pacific Rim countries negotiated by the Obama administration. Trump threatened to pull the United States out of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, if the global trade body interferes with his plans. He sees the persistent U.S. trade deficit as a sign of American weakness and believes that other countries have taken advantage of the U.S. in the trade deals, which is resulting to sharp declining of manufacturing jobs in the United States. He has even characterized current American trade negotiators as stupid people, political hacks and diplomats, and saps, and suggested that he should become the negotiator-in-chief. Because of the rise of Donald Trump, trade policy is currently at the center of political discourse in the United States and elsewhere. To truly understand the debate over trade, here's the report from Mr. Lorenz Paule.
Thank you, Jayvee, for telling us the opening case for this chapter. The benefits of trade. The great strength of the theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hexcher-Ollin is that they identify with the precision the specific benefits of international trade. Common sense suggests that some international trade is beneficial. For example, nobody would suggest that Iceland should grow its own oranges. Iceland can benefit from trade by exchanging some of the product that they can produce at low cost, like fish, for some products that it cannot produce at all, like oranges. Thus, by engaging in international trade, Icelanders are able to add oranges to their diet of fish. Next is the pattern of international trade. The theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hexcher-Ollin help explain the pattern of international trade that we observe in the world economy. Some aspects of the pattern are easy to understand. Climate and natural resource endowments explain why Ghana exports cocoa, Brazil exports coffee, Saudi Arabia exports oil, and China exports crawfish. However, much of the observed pattern of international trade is more difficult to explain. Trade theory and government policy. Although all these theories agree that international trade is beneficial to a country, they lack agreement in their recommendations for government policy. Mercantilism makes a case for government involvement in promoting exports and limiting imports. The theories of Smith, Ricardo, a Rolex Group logo sits on display above a luxury wristwatch store in Vienna, Austria. Mercantilism. The first theory of international trade, mercantilism, emerged in England in the mid-16th century. The principal assertion of mercantilism was that gold and silver were the mainstays of national wealth and essential to vigorous commerce. At that time, gold and silver were the currency of trade between countries. A country could earn gold and silver by exporting goods. Next is absolute advantage. According to Smith, countries should specialize in the production of goods for which they have an absolute advantage and then trade these goods for those produced by other countries. In Smith's time, he suggested the English should specialize in the production of textiles. While the French should specialize in the production of wine, England could get all the wine it needed by selling its textiles to France and buying wine in exchange. Similarly, France could get all the textile it needed by selling wine to England and buying textile in exchange. Smith's basic argument, therefore, is that a country should never produce goods home that it can buy at lower cost from the other countries. Comparative advantage. According to Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, it makes sense for a country to specialize in the production of those goods that it produces most efficiently and to buy the goods that it produces less efficiently from other countries, even if this means buying goods from the other countries that it could produce more efficiently itself. While this may seem counterintuitive, the logic can be explained with a simple example. Assume that Ghana is more efficient in the production of both cocoa and rice. That is, Ghana has an absolute advantage in the production of both products. Next is the extensions of the Ricardian model. Let us explore the effect of relaxing three of the assumptions identified earlier in the simple comparative advantage model. Next, we relax the assumptions that resources move freely from the production of one good to another within a country, that there are constant return to scale, and that trade does not change a country's stock of resources or the efficiency with which those resources are utilized. In immobile resources, in our simple comparative model of Ghana and South Korea, we assume that producers or farmers could easily convert land from the production of cocoa to rice and vice versa. While in diminishing returns, the simple comparative advantage model developed above assumed constant returns to specialization. By constant returns to specialization, we mean the units of resources required to produce a good cocoa or rice are assumed to remain constant no matter where one is on a country's production possibility frontier or PPF. Next is dynamic effects and economic growth. The simple comparative advantage model assumes that trade does not change a country's stock of resources or the efficiency with which it utilizes those resources. This static assumption makes no allowances for the dynamic changes that may result from trade. Trade, jobs, and wages. Paul Samuelson's critic looks at what happens when a rich country, the United States, enters into a free trade agreement with a poor country, China, that rapidly improves its productivity after the introduction of a free trade regime. Samuelson was particularly concerned about the ability to offshore service jobs that traditionally were not internationally mobile, such as software debugging, call center jobs, accounting jobs, and even medical diagnosis of MRI scans. Evidence for the link between trade and growth. Many economic studies have looked at the relationship between trade and economic growth. In general, these studies suggest that, as predicted by the standard theory of comparative advantage, countries that adopt a more open stance toward international trade enjoy higher growth rates than those that close their economies to trade. Next is Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Ricardo's theory stresses that comparative advantage arises from differences in productivity. Thus, whether Ghana is more efficient than South Korea in the production of cocoa depends on how productively it uses its resources. Ricardo stressed labor productivity and argued that differences in labor productivity between nations underlie the notion of comparative advantage. Swedish economist Eli Heckscher in 1919 and Bertil Ohlin in 1933 put forward a different explanation of comparative advantage. Now for further report, here's Ardail Sambat.
Thank you, Lorenz. Now reporting the product life cycle theory. Historically, the product life cycle theory seems to be an accurate explanation of international trade patterns. Consider photocopiers. The product was first developed in the early 1960s by Xerox in the United States and sold initially to US users. Originally, Xerox exported photocopiers from the United States primarily to Japan and the advanced countries of Western Europe. As demand began to grow in those countries, Xerox entered into joint ventures to set up production in Japan and Great Britain. In addition, once Xerox patents on the photocopier expressed, other foreign competitors began to enter the market, example, Canon in Japan and Levity in Italy. As a consequence, exports from the United States declined and US users began to buy some photocopiers from L0622 summarize the different theories explaining trade flows between nations. International Trade Theory Chapter 6177 Lower Cost Foreign Sources, particularly Japan. More recently, Japanese companies found that manufacturing costs are too high in their own country, so they have begun to switch production to developing countries such as Thailand. Thus, initially, the United States and now other advanced countries like Japan and Great Britain have switched from being exporters of photocopiers to importers. This evolution in the pattern of international trade in photocopiers is consistent with the predictions of the product life cycle theory that mature industries turn to go out of the United States and into low-cost assembly locations. New trade theory. It makes two important points. First, through its impact on economies of scale, trade can increase in the variety of goods available to consumers and decrease the average cost of those goods. Second, in those industries in which the output required to attain economies of scale represents a significant proportion of total world demand, the global market may be able to support only a small number of enterprises. Thus, world trade in certain products may be dominated by countries whose firms were first movers in their production. Increasing product variety and reducing costs. Imagine first a world without trade. In industries where economies of scale are important, both the variety of goods that a country can produce and the scale of production are limited by the size of the market. If a national market is small, there may not be enough demand to enable producers to realize economies of scale for certain products. Accordingly, those products may not be produced, thereby limiting the variety of products available to consumers. Alternatively, they may be produced by at such low volumes that unit costs and prices are considerably higher than they might be if economies of scale could be realized. Economies of scale, first mover advantages, and the pattern of trade. A second theme in new trade theory is that the pattern of trade we observe in the world economy may be the result of economies of scale and first mover advantages. First mover advantages are the economic and strategic advantages that accrue to early entrants into an industry. The ability to capture scale economies ahead of later entrants and thus benefit from a lower cost structure is an important first mover advantage. New trade theory argues that for those products where economies of scale are significant and represent a substantial proportion of world demand, the first movers in an industry can gain a scale-based cost advantage that later entrants find almost impossible to match. Thus, the pattern of trade that we observe for such products may reflect first mover advantages. Countries may dominate in the export of certain goods because economies of scale are important in their production and because firms located in those countries were the first to capture scale economies, giving them a first mover advantage. Implications of new trade theory. New trade theory has important implications. The theory suggests that nations may benefit from trade even when they do not differ in resource endowments or technology. Trade allows a nation to specialize in the production of certain products, attaining scale economies and lowering the cost of producing those products while buying products that it does not produce from other nations that is specialized in the production of other products. By this mechanism, the variety of products available to consumers in each nation is increased, while the average cost of those products should fall as should their price, freeing resources to produce other goods and services. National Competitive Advantage Porter's Diamond. Michael Porter, the famous Harvard strategy professor, has also written extensively on international trade. Porter and his team look at 100 industries in 10 nations. Like the work of the new trade theories, Porter's work was driven by a belief that existing theories of international trade told only part of the story. For Porter, the essential task was to explain why a nation achieves international success in a particular industry. Why does Japan do so well in the automobile industry? Why does Switzerland excel in the production and export of precision instruments in the pharmaceuticals? Why do Germany and the United States do so well in the chemical industry? These questions cannot be answered easily by the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and the theory of comparative advantage offers only a partial explanation. The theory of comparative advantage would say that Switzerland excels in the production and export of precision instruments because it uses its resources very productively in these industries. Although this may be correct, this does not explain why Switzerland is more productive in this industry than Great Britain, Germany, or Spain. Porter tries to solve this puzzle. There are four broad attributes of Porter theory. First is the factor endowments, a nation's position in factors of production such as skilled labor or the infrastructure necessary to compete in a given industry. Demand conditions, the nature of home demand for those industry, product, or service. Next is the related and supporting industries, the presence or absence of supplier industries and related industries that are internationally competitive. And lastly is the firm's strategy, structure, and rivalry, the conditions governing how companies are created, organized, and managed, and the nature of domestic rivalry. Now, for the evaluation of Porter's theory. Porter contends that the degree to which a nation is likely to achieve international success in a certain industry is a function of the combined impact of factor endowments, domestic demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and domestic rivalry. He argues that the presence of all four components is usually required for this diamond to boost competitive performance, although there are exceptions. Porter also contends that government can influence each of the four components of the diamond, either positively or negatively. Factor endowments can be affected by subsidies, policies toward capital markets, policies toward education, and so on. Government can shape domestic demand through local product standards or with regulations that mandate or influence buyer needs. Government policy can influence supporting and related industries through regulation and influence firm rivalry through such devices as capital market regulation, tax policy, and antitrust laws.
For the next headline, Boeing and Airbus are in a dogfight over illegal subsidies. Boeing and Airbus are the dominant players in the global market for large commercial jet aircraft of 100 seats or more. The two companies are locked in a relentless battle for market share. For decades, the two companies have been accusing each other of benefiting from government subsidies. In its early years, Airbus received 100% of the funds it needed to develop new aircraft from the governments of 4 European countries where Airbus operations were based: Germany, France, Spain, and the United Kingdom. These funds were provided in the form of loans at below market interest rates. The two companies reached an agreement of phasing out subsidies back in 1992, but Boeing walked away from the deal in 2004, claiming that Airbus was still benefiting from billions in illegal development subsidies. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, has been called on to rule on disputes between Airbus and Boeing, and the various governments involved. The WTO seems to believe that both Airbus and Boeing have been the recipients of illegal subsidies. To know the reason behind the government intervening in international trade, here's the report by Ms. Melanie Sumanga.
Thank you, Jewel, for introducing me and for telling us the opening case for this chapter. So, good morning, classmate. Again, I am Melanie Sumanga. To formally start this chapter, let me first define what is trade policy. Trade policy is the regulations and agreements that controls imports and exports to foreign countries. In trade policy, they use 7 main instruments to fulfill its regulations. Let me enumerate and explain it one by one. First is tariffs, second is subsidies, third is import quotas and voluntary export restraints, fourth, export tariffs and bans, fifth, local content requirements, sixth, administrative policies, and lastly, anti-dumping policies. First is tariffs. This is the oldest and simplest instrument of trade policy. It is a tax imposed on imports and sometimes imposed on exported products from a country. Export tariffs are less common than import tariffs. There are two categories of tariffs. First is specific tariffs. These are the tax imposed as fixed charge for each unit of a good imported. Secondly is ad valorem tariffs. This is a tax imposed as a proportion of the value of the imported goods. In most cases, tariffs are placed on imports to protect domestic producers from foreign competitions by raising the price of imported goods. However, tariffs also produce revenue for the government. There are important things to know about tariffs, and these are who suffers and who gains. As you can see in the presentation, tariffs are very beneficial to government and domestic producers because it allows them to raise its price for imported goods. And sadly, consumers suffers from it because they must pay for more certain import. Next, the two objectives of tariffs. First is to raise revenue for the government, and secondly, to reduce export from a sector, often for political reasons. Now, let's talk about subsidy. Subsidy is a government payment to a domestic producer. Subsidies take many forms, including cash grants, low-interest loans, tax breaks, and government equity participation in domestic firms. According to our reference, by lowering production costs, subsidies help domestic producers in two ways. First is by competing against foreign imports, and secondly by gaining export market. The third instrument is import quotas and voluntary export restraints. Import quotas is a direct restriction on the quantity of some goods that may be imported into a country. For example, the United States has a quota on cheese imports. The only firms allowed to import cheese are certain trading companies, each of which is allocated the right to import a maximum number of goods or maximum number of pounds of cheese each year. In some cases, the right to sell is given directly to the governments of exporting countries. This is a quota on trade imposed by the exporting country, typically at the request of the importing country's government. The next instrument is export tariffs and bans. Export tariffs is a tax placed on the export of a good. The goal behind an export tariff is to discriminate against exporting in order to ensure that there is sufficient supply of goods within a country. For example, in the past, China has placed an export tariff on the export of grains to ensure that there is a sufficient supply in their country. Next is export bans are basically policies that partially or entirely restrict the country or restrict the export of a good. Instrument is local content requirements or LCR. It is a requirement that some specific fraction of a good must be produced domestically. The requirement can be expressed in either physical terms, for example, 75% of the component of this product must be produced locally, or in value terms, in example, 75% of the value of this product must be produced locally. LCR provide protection for a domestic producer of parts in the same way an import quota does by limiting foreign competition. Second to the last instrument of trade policy is administrative policies. This is bureaucratic rule designed to make it difficult for imports to enter the country. And for the last instrument in trade policies is anti-dumping policies. Dumping is variously defined as selling goods in a foreign market at below their cost of production, or as selling goods in a foreign market at below their fair market value. There is a difference between these two definitions. The fair market value of a good is normally judged to be greater than the cost of producing that good because the former includes a fair profit margin. So, anti-dumping policies designed to punish foreign firms that engage in dumping. The ultimate objective is to protect domestic producers from unfair foreign competition. For the second topic of Chapter 7, the case for government intervention. There are two paths of arguments for government intervention, and these are political and economic. First, political arguments. It is concerned with protecting the interests of certain groups within a nation, which is normally the producers, often at the expense of other groups, which is normally the consumers, or with achieving some political objectives that lies under or outside the sphere of economic relationships, such as protecting the environment or human rights. And for the economic arguments, it is concerned with boosting the overall wealth of a nation to the benefit of all, both producers and consumers. To widen our knowledge for political arguments for intervention, there are 6 range of issues that included in this argument. First is protecting jobs and industries. It is necessary for protecting jobs and industries from unfair foreign competition. Competition is most often viewed as unfair when producers in an exporting country are subsidized in some ways by their government. And secondly, protecting national security. Defense-related industries often get this kind of attention. In example, aerospace, advanced electronics, or semiconductors. And thirdly, retaliating. Some argue that governments should use the threat to intervene in that trade policy as a bargaining tool to help open foreign markets and force trading partners to play by the rules of the game. And next, protecting consumers. Many governments have long had regulations to protect consumers from unsafe products. The indirect effect of such regulations often is to limit or ban the importation of such products. Second to the last, furthering foreign policy objectives. A government may grant preferential trade terms to a country with which it wants to build strong relations. Trade policy has also been used several times to pressure or punish states that do not abide by international laws or norms. And lastly, protecting human rights. Protecting and promoting human rights in other countries is an important element of foreign policy for many democracies. Governments sometimes use trade policy to try to improve the human rights policies of trading partners. And for the economic argument, there are 2 range of issues. First is the industry argument. Is by far the oldest economic argument for government intervention, since Alexander Hamilton proposed it in 1792. According to this argument, many developing countries have a potential comparative advantage in manufacturing, but new manufacturing industry cannot essentially compete with established industries in developed countries. Second, it relies on an assumption that firms are unable to make efficient long-term investments by borrowing money from the domestic or international capital market. And secondly, which is my last topic to discuss in this chapter, is the strategic trade policy. First, it is argued that by appropriate action, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that the firm or firms that gain first mover advantages is in an industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. Chapter will be discussed by my groupmate, Miss Ceannen Talapiero.
Thank you, Melanie. And for the next topic for this chapter, I am Ceannen S. Talapiero. The revised case for free trade. This response to the strategic trade policy argument constitutes the revised case for free trade. The strategic trade policy arguments of the new trade theories suggest an economic justification for government intervention in international trade. This justification challenges the rationale for unrestricted free trade found in the work of classic trade theorists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And for the next one is the retaliation and trade war. Krugman argues that a strategic trade policy aimed at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry is a beggar thy neighbor policy that boosts national income at the expense of other countries. Krugman may be right about the danger of a strategic trade policy leading to a trade war. It should also be noted that anti-dumping policies can be used to target competitors supported by subsidies who are selling goods at prices that are below their costs of production. The next one is domestic policies. Krugman concludes that in the United States, to ask the Commerce Department to ignore special interest politics while formulating detailed policy for many industries is not realistic. To establish a blanket policy of free trade with exceptions granted only under extreme pressure may not be the optimal policy according to the theory, but may be the best policy that the country is likely to get. Governments do not always act in the national interest when they intervene in the economy. Politically important interest groups often influence them. Development of the world trading system. Strong economic arguments support unrestricted free trade. Both governments recognize that their respective nations will benefit from lower trade barriers between them. But neither government is willing to lower barriers for fear that the other might not follow. Such a deadlock can be resolved if both countries negotiate a set of rules to govern cross-border trade and lower trade barriers. 1947 to 1979, GATT, Trade Liberalization and Economic Growth. Economic damage caused by the beggar-thy-neighbor trade policies that the Smoot-Hawley Act ushered in exerted a profound influence on economic institutions and ideology of the post-World War II. After the debacle of the Great Depression, opinion in the U.S. Congress had swung strongly in favor of the free trade. The United States emerged from the war both victorious and economically dominant. 1980 to 1993, the protectionist trends. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the trading system erected by the GATT came under strain as pressures for greater protectionism increased around the world. Exporting countries agreed to VERs to avoid more damaging punitive tariffs. First, the economic success of Japan during that time strained the world trading system, much as the success of China has created strains today. Bilateral voluntary export restraints, or VERs, circumvented GATT agreements because neither the importing country nor the exporting country complained to the GATT bureaucracy in Geneva, and without a complaint, the GATT bureaucracy can do nothing. The Uruguay Round and the World Trade Organization. The Uruguay round dragged on for 7 years before an agreement was reached on December 15, 1993. In the Uruguay round, member countries sought to extend GATT rules to cover trade and services. It went into effect July 1, 1995. The Uruguay round contained the following provisions. The first one is the tariffs on industrial goods were to be reduced by more than 1/3, and tariffs were to be scrapped on more than 40% of manufactured goods. Average tariff rates imposed by developed nations on manufactured goods were to be reduced to less than 4% of value, the lowest level in modern history. The third one is the agricultural subsidies were to be substantially reduced. The fourth one is GATT fair trade and market access rules were to be extended to cover a wide range of services. The fifth one is GATT rules also were to be extended to provide enhanced protection for patents, copyrights, and trademarks, especially the intellectual property. The sixth one is the barriers on trade in textiles were to be significantly reduced over 10 years. And the last one is the World Trade Organization was to be created to implement the GATT agreement. The World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization acts as an umbrella organization that encompasses the GATT along with the two new sister bodies, one on services and the other on intellectual property. Arbitration panel reports on trade disputes between member countries are automatically adopted by the World Trade Organization, unless there is a consensus to reject them. The World Trade Organization has taken over responsibility for arbitrating trade disputes and monitoring the trade policies of member countries. World Trade Organization experience to date. By 2016, the World Trade Organization had 164 members, including China, which joined at the end of 2001, and Russia, which joined in 2012. World Trade Organization members collectively account for 98% of world trade. Its creators expressed the belief that the enforcement mechanisms granted to the World Trade Organization would make it more effective at policing global trade rules than the GATT had been. World Trade Organization as global police. In general, countries involved have adopted the World Trade Organization's recommendations. The first 2 decades in the life of the World Trade Organization suggest that its policing and enforcement mechanisms are having a positive effect. The fact that the countries are using the World Trade Organization represents an important vote of confidence in the organization's dispute resolution procedure. Expanded trade agreements. 2 of the first industries targeted for reform were the global telecommunication and financial service industries. As explained earlier, the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations extended global trading rules to cover trade in services. The World Trade Organization was also encouraged to extend its reach to encompass regulations governing foreign direct investment, something that GATT had never done. Future of the World Trade Organization, unresolved issues in the Doha round. Since the successes of the 1990s, the World Trade Organization has struggled to make progress on the international trade front. Confronted by a slower growing world economy after 2001, many national governments have been reluctant to agree to a fresh round of policies designed to reduce trade barriers. We shall look at each in turn before discussing the latest round of talks between the World Trade Organization members aimed at reducing trade barriers, the Doha round, which began in 2001 and now seem to be stalled. Anti-dumping actions. Anti-dumping actions proliferated during the 1990s and 2000s. World Trade Organization rules allow countries to impose anti-dumping duties on foreign goods that are being sold cheaper than at home or below their cost of production when domestic producers can show that they are being harmed. Between 1995 and mid-2016, World Trade Organization members had reported implementation of some 5,132 anti-dumping actions to the World Trade Organization. Protectionism in agriculture. Tariff rates on agricultural products are generally much higher than the tariff rates on manufactured products or services. Another focus of the World Trade Organization has been the high level of tariffs and subsidies in the agricultural sector of many economies. For example is the average tariff rates on non-agricultural products among developed nations are around 4%. Protection of intellectual property. The 1995 Uruguay Agreement that established the World Trade Organization also contained an agreement to protect intellectual property, or the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS agreement. Another issue that has become increasingly important to the World Trade Organization has been protecting intellectual property. Inadequate protection of intellectual property reduces the incentive for innovation. Market access for non-agricultural goods and services. Although the World Trade Organization and the GATT have made big strides in reducing the tariff rates on non-agricultural products, much work remains. The World Trade Organization would like to bring down tariff rates still further and reduce the scope for the selective use of high tariff rates. In particular, while average tariffs are low, high tariff rates persist on certain imports into developed nations, which limit market access and economic growth.
Multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. In response to the apparent failure of the Doha round to progress, many nations have pushed forward with multilateral or bilateral trade agreements, which are reciprocal trade agreements between two or more partners. For example, in 2014, Australia and China entered into a bilateral free trade agreement. Similarly, in March 2012, the United States entered into a bilateral free trade agreement with South Korea.
A new round of talks, Doha. In 2001, the World Trade Organization launched a new round of talks between member states aimed at further liberalizing the global trade and investment framework. As of early 2017, the goal was to reduce tariffs for manufactured and agricultural goods by 60 to 70% and to cut subsidies to half of their current level, but getting nations to agree to these goals was proving exceedingly difficult. A new round of talks, Doha. In 2001, the World Trade Organization launched a new round of talks between member states aimed at further liberalizing the global trade and investment framework. As of early 2017, the goal was to reduce tariffs for manufactured and agricultural goods by 60 to 70% and to cut subsidies to half of their current level, but getting nations to agree to these goals was proving exceedingly difficult. And for the last topic for this chapter, the world trading system under threat. In 2016, two events challenged the long-held belief that there was a global consensus behind the 70-year push to embrace free trade and lower barriers to the cross-border flow of goods and services. We discussed Brexit in more detail in Chapter 9, but it is worth noting that the British intention to withdraw from what is arguably one of the most successful free trade zones in the world is a big setback for those who argue that the free trade is a good thing.